Who should be allowed to vote? All societies have certain restrictions on who's allowed to vote. Some countries just it's very simple, citizens and beyond a certain age. Others it's a little bit more um, controversial. Now, voting in the ancient world was not a common thing. So we have an example in ancient Athens and ancient Rome where certain people were allowed to elect political leaders, but um, these are rare cases in history. So we're going to focus more on modern history, and so we go to the United States. So you have after the Declaration of Independence, they had to decide. All right, well, who exactly are we going to allow to vote? And they did have the precedent because they already had a form of democracy. So they weren't necessarily coming up with a new system. It was more of recycling what they were already using. And so they decided that only white Protestant males who owned land could vote, right? So that was just generally who was allowed to vote. Now you'll notice women were excluded from there. However, over the next 30 years or so, there were states that had given voting rights to a large group of people, but eventually the country came together and said, "All right, we got to do this a certain way," and um, and so women eventually were completely excluded from voting. And then you have religious restrictions in certain places. So if you didn't belong to a certain religious group, then you weren't allowed to vote. And as far as that property requirement, well, it went state by state. And after the U.S. Civil War, eventually blacks were granted citizenship and then allowed to vote in separate amendments. And then in 1920, all citizens were allowed to vote regardless of gender. However, this only applied to primarily blacks and whites. So if you were Asian or Indian, you didn't uh, you weren't allowed to vote. And then because of the Vietnam War, you had a lot of young men going off to war that weren't allowed to vote. So this was corrected, and there was another amendment to lower the voting age to 18. And also, some states today still don't allow convicted felons to vote, especially when they're in prison. But even when they get out and complete their sentences, there are still states that have restrictions. And some states, the governor has to reinstate their voting rights. So, however you want to break this down, there are a number of reasons why people have been not allowed to vote, over the centuries. And so, why have certain people been excluded from voting? People give lots of reasons, and here are a few of them. And some, why was land ownership one of the requirements? Well, that's something you should probably look into. Um, you know, but in many cases, it was just plain old discrimination at its finest. People saying you're not good enough or smart enough or a man or whatever it is. So, today a lot of these, if you gave the same reasons today, people would say, well, that's foolish. But times change, and so one of the major questions you need to address is how does voting affect our lives? And so when you determine who should vote, well, you should think of what the consequences would be when deciding who gets to vote. And so, uh, in its broadest sense, elected officials they decide policies, whether regardless of the level of government, whether it's local, county, state, national, that even affect international foreign policy. Uh, these elected officials are the ones responsible for that. Sometimes when a lot of people don't know when you vote, it's not just to elect somebody. Sometimes you're also voting to authorize some sort of spending, usually through taxes, of course, or an additional tax. But sometimes it's for school measures or to build certain infrastructure projects or whatever it is. Also, during elections, you also elect judges, you elect sheriffs, uh, school board, supervisors or school board members, right? So there's a lot of people that are elected, and so you know everyday citizens are the ones responsible for casting a ballot to choose them. And so, needless to say, there's a lot at stake when we vote. And so, should every citizen that just meets a certain age requirement be allowed to vote, or should there be more restrictions or requirements involved in determining who gets to vote?